The story of Gideon from the Holy Bible and the takeaway from his life. Gideon was the fifth judge and renowned as the greatest of Israel. The account of his life is recorded in Judges 6:11 through 8:32. The backdrop for Gideon's biography begins with the Israelites being ravaged by the Midianites as a consequence of Israel's disobedience to God. For 7 years, they faced invasions from the Midianites, Amalekites, and Eastern foreigners who ruined their crops and destroyed their cattle. God's discipline through the foreign nations caused the Israelites to cry out to God for help. God hears their cries and graciously intervenes to deliver his people. He starts by sending the angel of the Lord to Gideon to call him into service. Gideon, whose name means cutter or cutter of trees, belonged to an undistinguished family of the Abiezrites, and he saw himself as unfit for God's service. During his conversation with the angel, it becomes apparent to Gideon that he was speaking to the Lord himself. But Gideon needed proof positive that it was, in fact, God calling him to the divine task of leading a military force against Midian. Gideon asked the angel of the Lord to stay where he was while Gideon went to prepare a meal. Gideon returned with some food, which he set on a rock. Then God gave a sign. The angel of the Lord touched the meat and the unleavened bread with the tip of the staff that was in his hand. Fire flared from the rock, consuming the meat and the bread, and the angel of the Lord disappeared. Verse 21. Gideon built an altar in that place and called it, "The Lord is Peace," because he had seen God and did not die. He asked God for another sign to confirm his calling. He put out a piece of wool overnight and asked God to make it wet while keeping the surrounding dirt dry. God graciously did as Gideon asked. Then Gideon asked for yet another sign. This time he asked God to keep a fleece dry while making the surrounding dirt wet. Again, God complied, and Gideon was finally convinced that God meant what he said, and that under Gideon's leadership, the nation of Israel would have victory over Midian. Before entering into battle, Gideon's troops numbered 32,000, but in obedience to God, he reduces them by 22,000. God further pares down his army, leaving Gideon just 300 men. This was against an enemy that is described as thick as locusts, with camels as countless as the sand on the seashore. God's purpose was to prevent Israel from boasting that their own strength had saved them. That night, God sent Gideon into the midst of the Midianite camp. There, Gideon overheard a couple of frightened Midianites discussing a dream that they took to portend disaster for them. Hearing this encouraged Gideon, and he rallied his troops. Using some unusual tactics, Gideon and his 300 men attacked the Midianite coalition and routed the enemy troops. The Lord gave victory to Gideon with just 300 men. After the victory, the people of Israel wanted to make Gideon their first king. But he objected, saying, "I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." The peace won by Gideon lasted for a generation. The takeaway from the story of Gideon. Lesson number 1. God sees the best in every man. The book of Judges introduces Gideon in a somewhat strange way. Gideon was threshing wheat in a wine press. Normally, a person threshes wheat out in the open on a threshing floor. Gideon was afraid that the Midianites will find his crops, and so he hides himself. In the eyes of man, we can certainly see that Gideon is not a mighty man, nor a man of valor. The strong and fearless warriors do not hide as what Gideon is doing. However, God looks at every man and sees the best in them. When God calls Gideon a mighty man of valor, he is serious, and he is not mistaken. He means every word that he says. God puts his confidence on Gideon, and that should be more than enough for him. Just like Gideon, who was called by God of what he will become, God also calls us sons and daughters, because that is exactly what we are and what we will become in the future. Lesson number 2. God is willing to help increase our faith. We know that Gideon is a faithful man who deserves to be mentioned. However, Gideon is not always like that. He is a man who has little faith, confidence, and trust in God. The many years of being afflicted by the Midianites and the absence of God's deliverance has made him a coward. Nevertheless, God sees Gideon as an unfinished product. He knows that Gideon is better than his current situation. God will then set different events to further improve the faith of Gideon. Do you see the ways where God is trying to improve your faith for a specific purpose? Lesson number 3. The few that we have can turn into many by God. After receiving the sign of the fleece from God that he will truly be with Gideon, it is now time to gather the mighty army that will defeat the Midianites. At first, Gideon was able to gather about 32,000 men to battle against their enemies. However, God deems this as too many for his purpose. In case that the battle was engaged with this number, the Israelites would soon attribute their victory to themselves rather than God. Gideon finally obtained his army of 300 men. So from 32,000 men, his army is now composed of 300. But Gideon knows that God is with them, and that is more than enough. We must realize that God is not after the quantity, but the quality. God can magnify the little that we have. All we have to do is to surrender and give it to Him. Do you feel small? He can make you mighty. Lesson number 4. Let God rule your life and not men. The legendary and epic victory of Gideon against the Midianites soon spread throughout the land of Israel. Gideon suddenly attained a superstar status, and many people started to look up to him. They have seen how Gideon transformed from a man hiding in the winepress to a man leading 300 men to victory. Gideon saw something that the Israelites did not see. The Israelites lost their sight to their one and true God. They have lived their life by sight and not by faith. We need to learn that God should be the ruler of our lives. God should be the center of our lives. We need to remember that we are to live this life according to His will and not our will.